The Sears department store on the second floor of America's first indoor shopping mall hummed with the ordinary soundtrack of consumer prosperity. Muzak filtered through ceiling speakers, cash registers chimed their mechanical rhythm, and the scent of new fabric mingled with department store perfume. Outside, the Minnesota winter still clung to the edges of spring, but inside Southdale Center, climate control maintained the perfect temperature for capitalism. Nobody expected history to unfold between racks of polyester blouses and discount denim. Sharon Kowalski had worked in the women's clothing section for 3 years. At 42, she knew every corner of her domain. The way light fell for the frosted windows at different times of day, which fitting rooms at loose hinges, where teenagers tried to shoplift. She prided herself on noticing things others missed. That Tuesday afternoon, as she reorganized a display of spring cardigans, something made her pause. The fitting room corridor ran along the back wall. 6 individual stalls with full-length mirrors and those saloon-style half-doors that preserved modesty while allowing staff to monitor occupancy. Sharon had just helped a customer, a pleasant woman in her 30s trying on a yellow sundress, into stall number 4. But as Sharon passed stall number 3, supposedly empty, she caught something in the peripheral vision that triggered her internal alarm. A reflection where there shouldn't be one. She stopped, turned back slowly. The fitting room door stood slightly ajar, the interior dim. But in the mirror, positioned at an angle that caught light from the corridor, she saw it clearly. A face. Male. Motionless. Watching. Sharon's first thought was simple embarrassment. A man had accidentally wandered into the women's section. It happened occasionally, usually followed by profuse apologies. But something about this reflection stopped her from calling out. The face wasn't sheepish or confused. It was utterly still, with the kind of calculated observation she associated with security guards or police detectives. The eyes were what troubled her most. Even in reflection, even from this angle, they possessed an intensity that seemed wrong for a department store on a Tuesday afternoon. Sharon approached the fitting room, her sensible shoes soundless on the carpeted floor. "Excuse me, sir?" This is a women's fitting area. No response. The reflection didn't move. She pushed the door open fully, her hand shaking slightly. The fitting room was empty, completely empty. No man, no clothes, nothing but the standard beige walls and the full-length mirror mounted on the back wall. Sharon stepped inside, confused now. Her rational mind tried to reconcile what she'd seen with the evidence before her. She examined the mirror, running her hand along its edges. Solid, mounted flush to the wall. She looked at the angles, trying to understand how a reflection could appear in an empty room. That's when she noticed the wall itself felt wrong. Too thin. When she knocked, a gesture born from pure instinct. The sound came back hollow. Before Sharon could process this discovery, a voice from the corridor made her jump. "Excuse me, is someone using this one?" A customer stood at the door, holding a pair of slacks, looking at Sharon with mild impatience. The moment broke. Sharon smiled professionally, made an excuse about checking the mirrors mounting, and retreated. But as she walked back to the sales floor, her mind kept returning to that face in the reflection, those watching eyes. She decided to mention it to Paul Hendricks, the store security manager, during her break. That decision would set in motion a chain of events that would eventually reach the 7th floor of the J. Edgar Hoover Building in Washington, D.C. 3 hours earlier, uptown Minneapolis. Safe House Beta, 7. The man who would soon be reflected in a Sears mirror sat in a sparsely furnished apartment above a laundromat, listening to the rhythmic thump of industrial dryers below. Victor Belenkov, though he hadn't used that name in public for 4 years, was reading a 2-day-old copy of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune when the phone rang. 1 ring. Pause. 3 rings. Pause. 2 rings. The recognition signal from his FBI handler, Special Agent Gerald Mathis. Victor picked up without speaking, waiting for the verbal confirmation. "The weather's supposed to improve by Friday," Mathis said, his voice flat and professional. "I prefer the cold," Victor responded, completing the authentication protocol. "We need to meet. Today. Something's come up regarding the Sokolov network." Victor felt the familiar tightness in his chest. Yevgeny Sokolov had been his commanding officer in the KGB's first chief directorate before Victor's defection in 1974. If the FBI had new intelligence on Sokolov's operations in the United States, it meant his former colleagues were still active, still dangerous. Where? Victor asked. Southdale, the usual spot, 4 o'clock. And Victor, come clean, no surveillance counters this time. We've swept her out. The line went dead before Victor could protest the location. Southdale Center was exposed, public, full of unpredictable variables. But that was precisely why Mathis chose it. In the tradecraft of Cold War espionage, the most anonymous hiding place was often in plain sight, surrounded by American shoppers who would never imagine that the thin man browsing sporting goods was a Soviet intelligence officer who had betrayed his country. Victor had been resettled in Minneapolis under the FBI's Defector Protection Program, precisely because of its Middle American anonymity. No coastal paranoia, no diplomatic intrigue, just snow, shopping malls, and the bland comfort of suburban ordinariness. For 4 years, he'd lived as Victor Bell, a technical writer for Honeywell, a divorced bachelor with no close friends and carefully cultivated boring habits. But the KGB had long memories and patient vengeance. Victor knew that somewhere in Moscow Center, a file with his photograph still sat on a desk, marked with a red stripe that indicated elimination authorized. He dressed carefully for meeting, not too formal, not too casual. A brown corduroy jacket, khaki slacks, an unremarkable striped shirt. The kind of outfit that disappeared into background scenes of American life. Before leaving, he performed his habitual security check, scanning the street from behind closed curtains, timing his exit to coincide with the building's regular traffic patterns, taking mental note of every parked car and pedestrian within visual range. The surveillance detection route he'd planned took him through downtown Minneapolis, across 3 bus transfers, and finally to the Southdale station via public transit. Mathis had told him to come clean, but Victor's survival instinct wouldn't allow complete trust. He performed abbreviated counter-surveillance anyway, watching for the telltale signs. The same face in 2 different locations, vehicles that matched his movements, anyone paying too little attention to their surroundings. He detected nothing. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it made him more nervous. By 3:45 p.m., Victor stood outside Sears, studying the afternoon crowd. Mothers with children, elderly couples walking for exercise, teenagers clustered near the record store. Normal, peaceful, oblivious. He entered through the main doors, moving with the crowd, and headed toward the prearranged meeting spot, the sporting goods section on the 2nd floor, near the fishing equipment. But as he crossed through the women's clothing department, taking a shortcut he'd memorized during his previous reconnaissance, something made him pause. Instinct, that 6th sense that had kept him alive through 12 years of intelligence work. Someone was watching him. Victor's training took over immediately. Don't stop moving. Don't look around obviously. Use reflective surfaces to scan your surroundings. He angled toward a display of women's coats, positioning himself to use a glass partition behind them as a mirror. There, 30 feet back near the fitting rooms, a heavy-set man in a dark windbreaker, pretending to examine a rack of blouses, but clearly focused on Victor's movement. KGB? FBI surveillance Mathis hadn't mentioned? Local security spotting a suspicious male in women's clothing? Victor had perhaps 15 seconds to make a decision. Running would confirm suspicion. Confronting the watcher was suicide if it was hostile. His eyes scanned for alternative exits, calculating distances and angles with a mechanical precision that had made him valuable to both his former masters and his current handlers. The fitting room corridor offered a temporary refuge, narrow, with limited sight lines, potential rear exits through stockroom areas that most American stores left unsecured. It was a desperate move, but Victor had survived worse situations through controlled desperation. He moved casually toward the fitting rooms, maintaining his cover as an uncertain shopper who might be lost. The corridor was empty except for a woman in one of the stalls, humming along to the store's background music. Victor entered the 3rd fitting room, the one with the slightly ajar door he'd noted, and stepped inside. The small enclosed space immediately felt wrong. Too confining. No exit except the way he'd entered. Victor turned to assess his tactical situation and found himself facing the full-length mirror mounted on the back wall. His own reflection stared back. Drawn face, cautious eyes, the posture of a man who'd lived for years glancing over his shoulder. But in the mirror's angle, he could also see a sliver of the corridor outside, including the approaching shadow of the man who'd been following him. Victor froze, barely breathing, his mind racing through options. If he was trapped here, if this was KGB finally catching up, the shadow paused just outside the fitting room. Victor could hear breathing, heavy and deliberate, then a woman's voice, sharp with retail authority. "Sir, can I help you find something?" Sharon Kowalski had just begun her intervention, and in doing so, she'd inadvertently saved Victor's life, while simultaneously exposing him to a different kind of danger entirely. The danger being noticed, remembered, identified. Victor remained absolutely still in the fitting room, his reflection held in that mirror like a photograph, waiting for the moment to pass, unaware that his face had already been seen, already registered in one observant employee's memory. The man in the windbreaker mumbled something about looking for his wife and retreated toward the main sales floor. Victor waited exactly 90 seconds, counted them silently, precisely, before emerging. The corridor was empty now. He walked calmly toward the sporting goods section, his heart rate deliberately controlled, his mind already composing the incident report he'd give to Mathis. He never made it to that meeting, because by the time Victor Belenkov left the Sears fitting room corridor at 2:51 p.m., Sharon Kowalski was already describing his face to Paul Hendricks in the security office, and Paul Hendricks, a former military policeman with intelligence contacts from his service in West Germany, was already wondering why the face seemed familiar from classified briefing materials he'd seen during his Army career. The reflection had been captured, not on film, not in a photograph, but in human memory. And in the Cold War, memory could be as dangerous as any camera. Special Agent Gerald Mathis stood at his office window, watching rush hour traffic crawl through downtown Minneapolis, and tried to understand how an operation 4 years in the making had just collapsed in a department store fitting room. Victor hadn't shown for the meeting. Not at 4 o'clock. Not at the backup window at 4:30. Not at the emergency fallback location at 5. In the taxonomy of defective behavior, this meant one of 3 things. Victor had been compromised and was dead, or captured. Victor had detected hostile surveillance and gone to ground in emergency protocol, or Victor had decided to run. Mathis didn't believe the third option. He'd worked with Victor Belenkov since the defection in 1974, had watched the Russian navigate the psychological collapse that came with betraying everything he'd known. Victor was many things, paranoid, precise, occasionally insufferable in his insistence on tradecraft protocols. But he wasn't impulsive. If Victor ran, he'd signal. If Victor was compromised, there would be indicators, which left option 2. Something had spooked him at Southdale. Mathis was reaching for the phone to initiate emergency contact protocols when it rang first. The switchboard operator's voice came through, professionally neutral. "Agent Mathis, I have a Paul Hendricks from Sears Security on line 2. He says it's urgent and specifically asked for someone in counterintelligence." Mathis felt ice form in his stomach. Put him through? The voice that came on the line was careful, measured, with a particular cadence of someone who'd been trained to report accurately. "Agent Mathis? My name is Paul Hendricks. I'm the security manager at Sears in Southdale Center. I'm calling because I have an employee who witnessed something unusual this afternoon, and after speaking with her, I believe it may be relevant to federal law enforcement." "Go on." Mathis kept his voice neutral, but his hand had already moved to the notepad on his desk. At approximately 2:47 p.m., one of our sales associates observed a man in the women's fitting room area. Male, approximately 5'9", thin-build, dark hair, age somewhere between 35 and 45. She describes his behavior as unusually observant, almost surveillance-like. The unusual part is that she saw him in the mirror of an empty fitting room before he actually appeared in the corridor. Mathis's pen stopped moving. "I'm sorry, could you clarify that? I know how it sounds, Agent, but my employee is reliable, and she's quite clear about what she saw." She noticed a reflection in the fitting room mirror that didn't correspond to anyone physically present. Moments later, A man matching that description entered the fitting room. She approached to question him, and he left quickly when another customer arrived. Did your employee get a clear look at his face? Yes. Clear enough that when I showed her some reference materials from my previous military service, she identified him. The ice in Mathis's stomach spread to his chest. What reference materials? There was a pause, the kind of pause that comes when someone is deciding how much classified information they can reveal over an unsecured phone line. Agent Mathis. I served with Army intelligence in West Germany from 1970 to 1973. During that assignment, I received briefings on Soviet intelligence personnel and their operational patterns. I maintained some documentation from that period for personal reference. One of the briefing packets included photographs of KGB officers operating in Western Europe. And the man my employee described matches a photograph from that packet. A first chief directorate officer named Viktor Belenkov, listed as a priority target for identification and monitoring. The briefing materials indicated he was involved in technology acquisition operations and was considered highly dangerous. The date on the packet was 1972. Mathis closed his eyes. The world's worst-case scenario and best-case scenario had just collided in a shopping mall fitting room. Worst case, a civilian had identified a protected defector. Best case, the identification was contained and could be controlled. Mr. Hendricks, I need you to listen very carefully. First, you did the right thing by calling. Second, I need you to not discuss this with anyone else, including your employee, until I arrive. Can you keep both yourself and the witness available at the store for the next hour? Yes, sir. We're both here now. Good. I'm leaving immediately. Do not use Viktor Belenkov's name again over any phone line, secure or otherwise. Do not make copies of any documents. Do not write anything down. Just wait. Mathis hung up and immediately dialed a direct line to his supervisor, Special Agent in Charge Douglas Tierney. The conversation was brief and tense. We have a COVCOM breach on Frost Phoenix, Mathis said, using the operational cryptonym for Victor's resettlement. Civilian identification at the primary area of operation. I need a containment team and a legal consult on witness management. Tierney's response was immediate. I'm authorizing a full lockdown protocol. Get to that witness before anyone else does. And Gerald, find our asset. If he's running scared, he's vulnerable. If he's vulnerable, Moscow will find him. 22 minutes later, Mathis pulled into the Southdale Center parking lot with a two-agent support team. They entered through a service entrance, avoiding the main shopping areas, and were escorted by mall security to the Sears administrative offices. Paul Hendricks met them in a small conference room. He was exactly what Mathis expected. Early 40s, military bearings softened by 4 years of civilian life. The kind of competent, detail-oriented individual who noticed things others missed. Dangerous in his way. Sharon Kowalski sat beside him, nervous but composed. She brought a cup of coffee that she wasn't drinking, and her hands kept moving to smooth her skirt, a physical manifestation of anxiety. Mathis introduced himself carefully, showing credentials, establishing authority without being threatening. He'd done this before, managing civilian witnesses who'd stumbled into classified operations. The key was to make them feel important and trusted while simultaneously controlling every aspect of their knowledge and behavior going forward. Mrs. Kowalski, Mathis began, sitting across from her with his notepad open, I want you to understand that what you witnessed this afternoon is connected to an ongoing federal investigation. I can't provide details, but I can tell you that your observations are extremely valuable. I need you to describe, in as much detail as you can remember, exactly what you saw. Sharon nodded, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke, her recall was precise, the kind of natural observational accuracy that made her both valuable and dangerous as a witness. I was working the sales floor, organizing the spring cardigan display near the fitting rooms. I just helped a customer into stall 4. As I passed stall 3, I saw a reflection in the mirror. A man's face. He was just watching, not moving, very still, very focused. Can you describe the face? Sharon closed her eyes, recreating the memory. Thin, sharp features, dark hair, but I couldn't tell if it was brown or black because of the lighting. High cheekbones. The eyes were what I remember most, very intense, very aware, like he was studying everything around him. I'd say late 30s, maybe early 40s. He had this look like someone who'd seen difficult things. Mathis made notes, though he already knew this was Victor. The description was too accurate, too specific. What happened next? I called out to him, telling him he was in the women's section. No response. I pushed the door open fully, and the room was empty, completely empty. I checked the mirror, knocked on the wall behind it. It sounded hollow, which seemed strange. Then a customer interrupted me. When did you actually see the man physically? Just a minute or two later. He was walking through the women's section, kind of hurried, but trying not to look hurried, if that makes sense. He went toward the fitting rooms, and I saw him enter stall 3, the one where I'd seen the reflection. Another man was following him, heavy set, wearing a dark jacket. That's when I went to find Paul. Mathis looked at Hendricks. You showed her a photograph? Not exactly. I showed her a page from an old briefing packet that had several faces on it. No names attached. I asked if any of them looked familiar. She identified one immediately. Do you still have that packet? Hendricks slid a worn folder across the table. Mathis opened it carefully. Inside were photocopied pages from a NATO intelligence brief dated July 1972, titled Known Soviet Intelligence Personnel, Western Europe Theater. The quality was poor 4th or 5th generation photocopies, but the faces were clear enough. Sharon pointed to one photograph without hesitation. That's him. Same face I saw in the mirror. It was Viktor Belenkov, circa 1972, photographed covertly in Copenhagen during an operation targeting American defense contractors. In the photo, Victor looked younger, less weathered, but the essential features were identical. The eyes especially, that characteristic intensity that Sharon had described as like someone who'd seen difficult things. Mathis closed the folder and looked at both civilians carefully. The next few minutes would determine whether the situation remained contained or exploded into a security disaster. Here's what I can tell you, Mathis began, choosing his words with legal precision. The individual you observed is connected to a sensitive federal matter involving national security. I cannot discuss the specifics. What I need from both of you is absolute discretion. You cannot discuss what you saw with anyone, not family, not friends, not other employees. This is not a request. This is a requirement under federal law related to protection of ongoing investigations. Sharon looked frightened now. Is he dangerous? Should I be worried about? No, Mathis interrupted firmly. You are not in any danger. The individual you saw poses no threat to you personally. But your discretion is critical to protecting both federal interests and potentially innocent parties. Do you understand? Both nodded, though Sharon still looked uncertain. Mathis softened his tone slightly. I know this is strange and probably frightening. You did exactly the right thing by reporting what you saw. I'm asking you to do one more right thing. Forget this happened. Go back to your normal routines. If anyone asks unusual questions about customers or observations, contact me immediately. He slid business cards across the table. My direct number is on there. Day or night. Paul Hendricks leaned forward. Agent Mathis, with respect, is this man under U.S. protection, or is he a threat? It was the right question, asked by someone who understood the complexity of Cold War intelligence operations. Mathis couldn't provide a direct answer without compromising operational security, but he could redirect. Mr. Hendricks, your military service gave you insight into these matters. You understand compartmentalization and need to know protocols. I'm asking you to apply those principles now. The less you know, the safer everyone involved remains. Hendricks held his gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly. Understood. Mathis stood, signaling the interview's end. If you think of any additional details, call me immediately. Otherwise, this conversation ends here. Thank you both for your cooperation and your discretion. As Mathis and his team left the conference room, one of the junior agents, a recent Quantico graduate named Delacourt, waited until they were in the service corridor before speaking. Are we going to put surveillance on them? Make sure they don't talk? Mathis shook his head. No, that would draw more attention than it prevents. Hendricks understands operational security from his military background. The woman is scared enough to follow instructions. We document the contact, file the witness statements as classified, and move on. The real problem isn't them. It's Victor, Delacourt said. It's Victor, Mathis confirmed. He broke protocol by entering that fitting room instead of maintaining his route. He exposed himself to observation. And now he's running blind because he missed our meeting and doesn't know what we know. We need to find him before he does something desperate. They emerged into Mall proper, where the evening shopping crowd moved through brightly lit corridors with no awareness that federal agents were moving through them on urgent business. Mathis paused near the Sears entrance, looking back toward the women's section where, just 3 hours earlier, a simple reflection in a mirror had unraveled 4 years of careful protection. In Cold War intelligence, the smallest operational mistakes often created the largest consequences. A face reflected in a mirror, a curious employee with good recall, a former military policeman with old briefing materials, all of it converging in one accidental moment. Mathis pulled out his mobile radio and contacted the FBI command post. Initiate full search protocol for Frost Phoenix. Check his apartment, his work location, and all known secondary contacts. If he surfaces, I want immediate notification. And someone get me the transcripts from the KGB listening post-intercepts for the last 72 hours. If Moscow knows something we don't, I want to know what it is. As his team dispersed into the mall's parking lot, Mathis stood alone for a moment in the artificial warmth of controlled climate, surrounded by American prosperity and Cold War secrets, wondering where Viktor Belenkov was hiding and whether he'd ever feel safe enough to come in from the cold again. Somewhere in Minneapolis, a Soviet defector was making decisions that would determine whether he lived or died, and Mathis had to find him before the KGB did. The reflection in the mirror had started a countdown. How it ended depended on who reached Victor first. Viktor Belenkov sat in absolute darkness behind the hollow wall of the Sears fitting room. His legs had cramped hours ago, his bladder ached, and he counted 2,847 seconds since the last footsteps passed. But he remained utterly still, controlling his breathing with the discipline drilled into him at the Red Banner Institute. The maintenance access corridor was perhaps 18 inches wide, running the length of the fitting room bank. Victor had discovered it during reconnaissance 3 months earlier, one of dozens of architectural oversights he'd cataloged while memorizing emergency exits. American construction prioritized speed over security. For someone trained to disappear, these gaps were lifelines. When the heavy-set man in the windbreaker had approached, Victor's survival instinct overrode his training. He'd slip behind the access panel and vanish into the wall in 15 seconds. Sloppy tradecraft, but it had worked. He'd been here for 4 hours now. Through the thin wall, Victor heard fragments of conversation. The employee speaking to security, then federal agents arriving. He'd heard his own name mentioned. His cover was compromised. Victor Bell was finished. The careful identity he'd built over 4 years had lasted until reflection in a mirror gave him away. A sound interrupted his thoughts. Footsteps stopping directly outside. "Paul, come look at this." Sharon's voice, the observant employee. "What is it, Sharon?" This wall sounded hollow earlier. "There's a gap here behind the display rack, like a panel." Victor's heart rate accelerated. Store maintenance, probably. Old building, lots of access spaces. "Sharon, the FBI agent asked us to drop this. Whatever's going on, it's above our pay grade. I just want to understand what I saw. Sometimes understanding isn't worth the consequences. Come on, we need to finish closing procedures." The footsteps retreated. Victor exhaled silently. The woman was persistent, observant and persistent, a dangerous combination. He pulled out a small notebook and wrote by touch in Russian cipher. Assessment. Current identity unsustainable. Alternative. Disappear entirely from protection program. Recommendation. Implement contingency plan Omega 7. Omega 7 was his private plan. complete disappearance. No protection, no handlers, no official identity. Just cash, false documents acquired through criminal contacts, and a life built entirely off the grid. It meant the KGB couldn't track him through compromised FBI operations. The question was whether he had the courage to become truly invisible. Yevgeny Sokolov, his former commander, had told him once, "The moment you break faith, you become a ghost. You can never stop running, because we can never stop hunting. That's not cruelty, Victor. That's just the mathematics of trust." At 10:47 p.m., Victor carefully removed the access panel and emerged into the darkened corridor. His legs screamed as he stood. He moved toward the stockroom, tested the door unlocked. American security. Perpetually optimistic. Inside, he navigated by memory toward the loading dock. As Victor worked the lock, his mind was 3 moves ahead. Exit the dock, cross to the parking garage, locate his emergency vehicle. The sound of the safety being released stopped his thoughts completely. "Don't move, Victor." American accented English with a southern drawl. Not FBI. Something else entirely. "Turn around slowly. Hands where I can see them." Victor turned. A silhouette, medium build, professional stance, weapon at low ready. Male, early 30s, dark tactical clothing. Viktor Belenkov, formerly KGB First Chief Directorate, 4 years in FBI protection, currently engaged in unauthorized evasion. This man knew too much to be random security, but his approach was wrong for FBI. If you're FBI, where's your identification? "I'm not FBI. My employers believe you have information about KGB operations that hasn't been fully exploited. They like a conversation." "CIA. Does it matter? You're out of protection. Your cover's blown. I'm offering an alternative. Come with me, answer questions, and we'll set you up with resources that actually work. New identity. Real security." Victor calculated. The CIA had always been frustrated by FBI control over his debriefing. They believed he knew more than he'd revealed. They were right. What guarantees do I have? Absolutely none. But you're holding 0 cards right now. Before Victor could respond, new sounds cut through the tension. Rapid footsteps. Multiple sets, heavy and coordinated. The armed man tensed. "Damn it. They're faster than I expected." "Who?" "FBI containment team. Your handler figured out where you'd hide." He pulled out a business card. "If you change your mind, call that number within 48 hours. After that, you're on your own." He tossed the card and vanished into darkness. The loading dock door burst open. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness. "Victor, federal agents. Show me your hands." Victor raised his hand higher, the business card palmed carefully against his thumb. As FBI agents secured him, Victor realized a reflection in the Sears mirror had exposed him to a much larger game. The KGB wanted him dead. The FBI wanted him contained. And now, apparently, the CIA wanted him recruited. In the Cold War, being valuable to multiple agencies didn't make you safe. It made you a target from every direction at once. Round Pushpin Chapter 4, The Man in the Mirror. FBI Safe House, November 12th, Bloomington, Minnesota. March 16th, 1978, 9:34 a.m. Viktor Belenkov stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized himself. Not because his appearance had changed, but because the person staring back seemed to belong to someone else's life. Someone who hadn't spent 48 hours being interrogated by federal agents trying to understand how a routine meeting had collapsed into disaster. Gerald Mathis sat in the kitchen, exhausted. Washington's evaluating whether your protection can continue or if you need relocation to a federal facility. "You mean a prison," Victor said flatly. "I want to know why you abandoned 4 years of discipline because of one suspicious person in a mall." Mathis pressed. "That's not professional behavior. That's trauma response." Victor poured coffee he didn't want. "I remembered that I'm only alive because hundreds of people make daily decisions to protect me. Every one is a potential failure point. Eventually, someone in Washington will decide my intelligence has been exploited sufficiently. When that happens, what am I to you? A human being we made a commitment to protect. I'm a former Soviet officer, who betrayed his country. I have no illusions about what I am. Victor pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table. Tuesday night. A man was waiting in the stockroom, armed professional. Offered me an alternative arrangement. Said his employers had questions about KGB operations that hadn't been fully exploited. Mathis's expression darkened. CIA is running parallel surveillance on you. Or this was a provocation. Do you know more than you've told us? Mathis asked directly. Victor considered carefully. I've told you everything I consciously remember. But intelligence work isn't always conscious. There may be connections in my memory that haven't been properly accessed. Then let's access them. Washington wants cognitive interview specialists. If there's information valuable enough for CIA to risk illegal recruitment, we need to know. And after they extract everything, we give you the best chance at a real life. New identity, better documentation. A city where you can disappear effectively. Victor had one more request. I want to go back to Southdale to see the fitting room where this started. Southdale Center, Sears department store. March 17, 1978, 10:47 p.m. The darkened store felt alien. Victor walked flanked by Mathis and two agents, their footsteps echoing unnaturally. At stall 3, he studied the mirror where Sharon Kowalski had seen his impossible reflection. The geometry is simple, Victor said, touching the loose mirror. Angles and light. That's what I told you, Mathis replied. No mystery. But Victor wasn't satisfied. She saw me before I was here. In that moment, I became visible to everyone. For years of invisibility ended because someone noticed a reflection. Mathis stepped closer. You're looking for meaning where there's only accident. You were noticed because an employee glanced at a mirror at the right moment. That's the whole story. Then why am I still alive? Why didn't the KGB find me first? Why was CIA waiting instead of a Soviet wet team? Mathis's expression shifted. You've been visible the entire time. We've just been better at counter-surveillance. Tuesday's exposure was serious because it created witnesses outside our control, memories we can't erase. The cognitive interviews aren't just about information. They're about determining if I'm valuable enough to protect. Everything is cost-benefit analysis, Mathis admitted. We can't protect you forever. Eventually, every defector learns to protect themselves. Victor looked at his reflection one final time, a ghost caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. As they drove back, Victor made his decision. He would submit to the interviews. And when they'd extracted everything, when his value had been calculated and protection ended, he would use the resources he'd quietly accumulated, false documents, hidden cash, criminal contacts, and disappear properly, not as Victor Belenkov, not as Victor Bell, but as someone new, someone who understood that visibility was death, and true survival meant becoming so invisible that even mirrors couldn't catch your face. FBI file #SF 241-7789. Subject: Frost Phoenix. Declassification date: October 15, 2003. Subject completed cognitive debriefing March 20th to April 12, 1978. Intelligence identified 14 unknown KGB technology targets and partially reconstructed Soviet networks in Western Europe. On April 21, 1978, subject disappeared from federal protection during supervised transit in Chicago. Despite extensive searches, subject was not recovered. KGB debriefs 1979 to 1982 contain no references to subject's elimination. Current status: unknown. Case classified as voluntary departure. Sharon Kowalski and Paul Hendricks maintained silence until declassification. The Sears fitting room was demolished in 2015. If Victor Belenkov survived, he would be 86 years old. Survival probability without protection, less than 15%. But somewhere in America, perhaps, an elderly man with no official history shops at ordinary stores and never once looks at mirrors. He learned that lesson well.